Good morning and thank you everybody for coming to the launch today. Absolutely fantastic to be in Hobart. For people who don't know me, I'm Deborah Natoli, the CEO of Council to Homeless Persons in Victoria. And as you're aware, we've got a national publication and super proud about this one. There isn't anyone in this room that doesn't understand the intersect between poverty and homelessness, and being part of the COS family, we talked about poverty all the time as central to every policy position that we ran. Firstly, what I want to do is, we are very lucky today to have a special welcome to country by Lagana Hughes. So before we commence, I'm going to hand over to you, Lagana, and thank you for being here for us today.
Yakulina, Mina Lagana Hughes, Mina Tunapi, Pakanani, Mina Waipa, Miladina Mana Chuana, Waranka Tatumuna, Miladina Mowanina, Nipuluna, Lukuira Miladina, Palawa Pakina Paibuta, Waranka Putia, Nina Wulka, Mina Tunapi, Tata William Manta, Tatumuna Rala, Putia Nari, Rak Pakatawak. Minute Nafri, Patawillia Puni. Warrant Putia Warinini, Minute Nafri Patina, Palavanari. Hello and welcome. My name is Lagana Hughes, and I'm a proud Parliamentary from Chilana, Cape Island. We'll begin today by acknowledging the land on which we stand. More in the country, Nipaluna Hobart, on the island of Utawita, Tasmania. Occupied by the Palawa and Patina people for thousands of years, we have never taken sovereignty. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to my ancestors past. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to our elders. And I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. I thank you for having me today to welcome you to my land to my people. Lina, thank you and welcome.
Thank you for that beautiful welcome to country. And I also want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Muwanina people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge and make a statement on what was and what will always be Aboriginal land. That sovereignty was never ceded, and I extend that acknowledgement to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us today. Obviously very sad over the last month with the yes vote. We know that 80% of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders would have liked to see us move towards reconciliation in this country, and I'm sure everybody in this room stands with me to say that this has made us more committed than ever before to ensure that we reach reconciliation in this country. On a brighter note, we are very lucky today because we have Bronwyn Pike, who is the CEO of Uniting Vic TAS, here today to officially launch the Parity publication. And for those who don't know and work in Victoria, well, if you're in Victoria, you did know, unless you were living under the rock, that Bronwyn Pike had an outstanding career in Parliament, and for about 13 years, if I'm not mistaken, and 11 of those she was Minister for Housing. So we really couldn't ask for anyone better than Bronwyn to come and launch it today. So thanks for coming to Tasmania to Business Board.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and again, thank you. Lovely to see you again, and to hear you give that welcome in your own language is really powerful and moving, and I want to echo all the comments that Deborah has made, and of course make my own respectful acknowledgement of the land that we meet upon today. So, and I know you've got lots of other things to do, so nice to see you. Deb, thank you so much for the welcome, and thank you to your team. I noticed your deputy, Tom Johnson. I have to mention Tom because he did leave us to come and work, but higher cause with the Council for Homeless Persons. And of course, good to see Noel again. And thank you to everyone for all the work that's gone into this event, and of course to the addition of Parity that we're particularly launching today. Uniting, as most of you know, in Victoria and Tasmania has a pretty significant service footprint, and we deliver around 600 programs across a huge range of community services. The full spectrum really, you know, homelessness services, child and family, child protection, drug and alcohol, mental health, you know, I could keep on that list. We intervene early, hopefully, to help people avoid crisis and support people who live often isolated and on the margins of our community. But, you know, poverty is the common denominator in virtually all of those programs that we run. You know, we often have siloed responses. We think that, you know, because someone comes into a homeless service, it's a homelessness problem. It is a homeless problem, but of course, fundamentally, it's a problem of poverty. And so that's why I think reflecting on this is really important. I had the privilege this year, again, of being the co-chair of Anti-Poverty Week from the Victorian side, where everybody around the country, community services, organisations, Deb, when she was in her previous role in the causes, was part of that. And of course, my colleague, Jeremy Pettit, who's with us today, was the co-chair of Anti-Poverty Week here in Tasmania. So the fact that we were involved in that, and I know many of you were as well, makes me also particularly proud that we're sponsoring this edition of Parity this time. Now, we all know, and you know more than anyone because you're local here, that demand for homelessness and housing support in Tasmania is higher than ever. And we know a lot of those ingredients, the rising cost of living, rent, pushing people into homelessness, even people who we've never seen before, people who've never experienced this in their lives before, many people who are in fact fully employed. And there are people around Tasmania today, and I'm sure that in your services you know some of these people who don't know where they'll be sleeping tonight, or even where they'll get their next meal. Our emergency relief centres here in central Hobart and up in Wesley Hall and nearby Bridgewater, of course, like all agencies, reporting increased demand, and more and more people coming, and more people coming more often, needing support. And in a very concerning development, a number of new clients are presenting with significant chronic health issues and even terminal health conditions. They're coming with support because they need support to pay for medicines and for medical appointments. Now, I think everyone in this room would agree with me that in a wealthy country like Australia, how did it get to this? It shouldn't be like this. We are one of the richest nations on this planet, and it isn't right that 1 in 6 children in this incredibly wealthy country grow up in poverty. Now, you know, we all know about the cultural narrative that we've got here in Australia, you know, lucky country, everyone gets a fair go in Australia. I actually think that might be an aspiration, might be a bit of a myth, but it's not a reality. It's a falsehood. It somehow implies that everybody's on a level playing field, which we aren't, and it doesn't take account of the generational poverty that many people experience, the entrenched stigma that actually exists in both political and public discourse around people who are in need and might need some extra support, particularly through income support payments, where in the past these things which were seen as an important part of our social fabric have now become the occasion for people to be demonised, to be called bludgers, to be called leaners rather than lifters, as of course has been some of the rhetoric. And, you know, I find this incredibly distressing in this country that, you know, the term social security, which means security for the individual and security for the society, because when everyone's included, we are more secure, we grow, we develop, we are more cohesive. That has become so misused. And too often, people just don't appreciate the structural and systemic drivers of homelessness and poverty. 3.2 million people did not end up in poverty last night, overnight. They are the result, this is the result of years of lack of commitment and inadequate action by government, high levels of income disparity, growing and growing, low wage growth, a worsening housing crisis. And I was talking to some of my team who are here today that when I became housing minister in 1999, a long time ago, the Commonwealth had already started pulling away from the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement. The consensus around national and state action around the development of public and social housing was fraying at the edges even then, and it happened even before that. So, you know, this is not, and you know, people are jumping up and down going, oh, we've got a housing crisis in Australia. Well, hello. You know, like this is decades in the making. And there have been many points of time in that history, in this history, where things could have been done and where people have walked away from policies around taxation, the appropriate level of support to refurbish, renew and rebuild additional social housing, public housing, etc. So, you know, I think it's quite risky in many ways that people are now running around like headless chooks saying that this is something new and we've got to fix it. These are long-term systemic issues, and a big flush of money into the housing sector will help, but it's not enough. It won't address some of the deep and underlying structural inequalities that exist in Australian society. And, you know, things like the funding of private education is another example of a structural inequality in our society. So, you know, a number of you have been working in this sector. You know that what happened during COVID when the amount of job seeker was doubled, that we saw people genuinely for the first time being able to cover some of their day-to-day expenses. And we did a piece of research in our advocacy team where we spoke to consumers and demonstrated very strongly that you know, the evidence was that if you gave people just something that brought them up to the you know, on the poverty line, that their capacity to cope and to provide for their families was greatly increased. And of course, when it was taken away, all of those same competing claims, do I pay a bill? Do I pay for the rent? Do I, you know, let my kid go on a school excursion? Do I put food on the table? All those really, really horrible choices that people have to make. Pay my energy bills. So, you know, those findings will be of no surprise to you. The you know, research is really helpful for people to really understand that just by giving even a small amount of additional support, you can make an absolutely huge difference in people's lives, and you can set them on a pathway for a different life outcome. The solutions, as I said, are the same. They've been there all the time. What we really need is governments to have the courage to implement the solutions. And that's where I call on the whole community to be involved, because often governments lack courage because they feel they'll be punished at the polls. And we've seen that happen, where some brave initiatives have been brought forward, you know, which will deal with things like, you know, capital gains tax, you know, some of those kind of structural inequalities that we know exist within the housing market. And the media gets on board, and you know, you know, groups of people who are negative about that, and the community kind of get a voice. And that means it's incumbent on us to have a really loud voice and to systematically, as the council does, as Parity has done over years and years and years, keep telling the truth, keep putting out the alternative narrative, keep empowering the community to be the ones that say to the government, no, actually, we don't like living in an unequal society. We actually want to be in a lucky country, a place where there is a genuine fair go for everyone. Our communities do deserve better than what's happening right now. People do have the right to have the essentials of life: secure, safe, affordable housing, education, employment, fair income, decent incomes, security, nutritious food, meaningful connections. All of these things are not optional. They are things that so many of us enjoy, and we desperately want that for everyone in our community, because it's the right thing to do for our fellow human beings, and it makes for a stronger Australia. So, Deb, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here at this really special occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn and Uniting UTAS, because this edition would not have been possible without their support. So I do sincerely thank you. Now, the next speaker I'm going to introduce is the reason that we have this date and time. So Noel said to me, "You're never going to believe who can make it." But Professor Cameron Parsell, who he said to me is one of the best researchers in the country, can actually come to Tasmania to officially launch the edition. And this is the time he can make it, so this is the time we're holding it. So we are super pleased to have you here, Cameron, and he's a Professor of Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. Interestingly, his research examines multiple forms of social harm, such as homelessness, family violence, and poverty. And what his research does, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, he has a really great insight to how society responds to these social issues. And in fact, his most recent book argues that homelessness is a predictable, punishing, yet solvable social problem. And I have to say that really does align and resonate with the policy position of Council to Homeless Persons, who always says, we have a roadmap out of here. And as Bronwyn says, in terms of homelessness, we can solve it. We just need to get governments to have the courage to implement the right policies. On that note, thank you very much for officially launching, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good morning. That might be the highlight of my presentation so far. Before I present it, so it's going to be hard to come back. I too would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet. Thanks very much, Deborah, for the opportunity to launch this. And I wanted to start off by giving a shout out to Noel Murray, because I think Noel's leadership over many, many years with Parity has actually enabled our community, particularly the sector, people who are out there working, and also lived experience, to meaningfully and powerfully, if not disturbingly, demonstrate the nexus between poverty and homelessness. And I think Noel's leadership is really critical in this space. So I'm very, very pleased today to be able to offer a few notes. And I thought so much of what we want to talk about today is self-evident. Perhaps I'll move beyond that a little bit. And the self-evident nature is, of course, that we cannot decouple poverty from homelessness. We cannot decouple the way that homelessness both exacerbates people's poverty, but it also subverts people's capacity to move beyond homelessness. We know that it has compounding effects that actually harm human life. But what I want to talk about today is something a little bit different. I want to talk about our poverty of ambition. And when I mean our poverty and ambition, I'm talking about the way that we as a society set low expectations about people who are homeless. We set low expectations about homelessness. And when I say low expectations, I'm talking about the way we are now in the latest discussion paper, for example, are talking about responding to homelessness or providing more housing to people. We need to be very clear about an ambition of ending homelessness. We need to be very, very clear about it's an injustice we won't tolerate and we need to end it. We need to have higher expectations among the citizens who we exclude from housing, and those expectations can only be met when we're talking about ending poverty and homelessness simultaneously. And that's why I talk about this idea of a poverty of ambition. And I like this idea. I don't like the idea, but I like the idea of putting it on us. And what's important about putting it on us is that might be a nice idea that you might suggest in some societies, but it's unattainable. In Australia, as Bronwyn articulated, it is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable because we have something of a paradox. There are lots and lots of different ways that you can measure wealth in a country, and economists debate them. But by nearly all of those measures, Australia is almost one of the richest countries in the world. Credit Suisse says we are, for example, based on mean income, Australians are the second richest citizens in the world, and on mean income we're the fourth, and median we're the second richest citizens in the world. We have the world record among advanced economies of going the longest without a recession. Of course, during COVID, we actually didn't experience the economic collapse that many economies did. Of course, what I'm talking about here are statistical averages. They mask that this profound wealth is not equally distributed among our citizens. In fact, it is deliberately directed towards some citizens and excluded from others. It is not coincidental that a significant amount of the wealth that Australians have is attributed to the ownership of property. What we have in Australia is extreme wealth driven by a number of things, including digging holes in the ground and shipping it, but extreme wealth that's generated through the commodification of housing. No longer is housing seen as a means that citizens can live safely, live well, live with dignity, live healthily, but rather housing is a means that we speculate and leverage on to become wealthy. And this is not because people are mean. We have deliberate policies that enable us to become wealthy from housing. And that would be okay if everyone could become wealthy from housing, but of course we can't. One person or a section of society's capacity to become wealthy from housing means that we systematically exclude some others from housing. It is becoming, as we saw in the Mercury today, talking about the capacity of young people to move out of home. It's becoming more and more the case that one's capacity to achieve housing security is determined by the extent to how well they chose their parents. And this is a deep, deep problem within Australian society. And it goes back to this idea of our poverty of ambition, given that we have the wealth to do otherwise. And I also want to introduce this other idea of poverty by design. We are designing poverty-inducing policies. And you might say that this is mere speculation, but I think there are 3 points that are important to make here. We actually objectively have the wealth in Australia to end poverty and homelessness. We also have the technical or the intellectual, the empirical knowledge to end homelessness. We do not have, sadly, the community or the political will. And I really like to put this idea on the community will rather than blaming the politicians, because it's a collective decision that we make, even if indirectly. So I want to put it back on us in terms of this poverty by design. And this poverty by design might sound like a nice idea, but of course there are abundant evidence examples where it's actually true. We saw during COVID with income support increases through the Corona supplement or the economic stimulus payments, that it automatically lifted people out of poverty. But we likewise saw this, particularly in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, with massive injections of cash into homelessness services. What we saw within the sector, and we did a range of research projects, were people out on the front line saying that this is the first time in my career that I've been able to meet demand. Not demand that is attributed to the resources we have, but demand that's out there on the streets. We were able to go and provide accommodation to all people who needed it. This is a clear example that we could do something about homelessness. We could do something about income support when we changed our framing. Importantly and concerningly, the way we changed the policy to almost make it impossible to sleep rough by providing people decent accommodation was driven in part by a desire to ensure that people sleeping rough were benefited, but it was also driven in part by a concern that people sleeping rough might infect us. They might override our hospital systems. So our concern for people who were homeless at the time was driven a little bit through selfish reasons, but nevertheless, it's a clear example of the problem frame. Similarly with the income support, no longer, as Bronwyn articulated, do we see people who are poor as the dog bludgers. Rather, we saw them as, oh, people have been made poor by structural problems. We need to intervene. John Stuart Mill said this years ago that we distinguish between a personal problem and a societal problem. Poverty and homelessness became all of a sudden societal problems. This problem framing is really important. It's really important because it gives us the opportunities, the leverage to do things differently. And we do have at our hands the resources and the capacity to do things differently. But often in terms of homelessness, we think about the problem of homeless people. We see homelessness as something about them. And this is not just problematic in and of itself because it stigmatises and demonises people, but it also enables us to avert our gaze from the fundamental structural housing problems that are producing homelessness. And it also enables us to have low expectations. People are homeless or living in poverty. They have nothing, so anything that we do for them might be considered okay. And it comes to a very, very complicated question about how can we help someone experiencing poverty and homelessness if we don't end their poverty and homelessness, rather soothe the consequences of it? How can we be just in those situations? And this is a complicated question that we don't have clear answers for. What I do know is that I've written some critical things about funding and celebrating mobile washing machines and showers. I'm not going to talk about them today because I want to get more emails. But what I do want to talk about is a question that's been broached to me recently is, Cameron, what about these ideas of changing laws so people can sleep in their car though so they don't get fined, or changing laws so people can just go and take over empty houses, or legalising squatting? Now, if I was homeless, I would be annoyed with being fined for sleeping in my car or not being able to sleep in this second or third or fourth vacant property. I could see why you'd be pissed with that. I don't think that's the ideal solution. I don't think it's the ideal solution because it ignores what the big game in town is. The big game in town is the way that we've decided to make insufficient levels of affordable housing for all of our citizens. So it's a distraction. I can understand why people want to do it, but I don't think it is the desirable policy solution because it ignores the big problem and it lets the kind of the structural conditions that produce poverty and homelessness off the hook. What I want to argue, and I know we've only got a few more minutes to go, I want to argue that fundamentally we cannot end homelessness or poverty in Australia through some more policy tweaks. We can't end it through better collaboration and better practice, although I think we should do better policy, better collaboration, better practice. We also can't end it through better data and better evidence. And I think we should do more of those, particularly as a researcher, I think we should do more of those. Often we talk about addressing homelessness with a bit more data. We see it as a technocratic kind of a problem. It's not a technocratic problem, it's a problem of how we organise society. We need to actually transform how we think about society. We need to transform, first and foremost, beyond anything else, by recognising our shared humanity. People have access, people deserve housing for no other reason than their unique rights as a human. And we need to ensure that we change systems, that we change our practices to enable them to have it. And of course, we've been able to do this. We are really good in Australia at pilot initiatives, at one-off programs that work demonstrably well for the very, very lucky few who can get into them. And we often build an evidence base to demonstrate that they're effective, that people achieve home, that they're safe, they're having meaningful lives. and we save the taxpayer money. We're really good at doing these, but there are two problems. One fundamental problem is we don't institutionalise them within our system. Secondly, we know that people who experience chronic homeless, who have been on the streets for many, many years, they've had very, very predictable biographies. And those predictable biographies are characterised by society for failing them for many, many, many years. Often those predictable biographies could be determined in the maternity ward. We need to think about not just evidence-based solutions for people who are chronically homeless, but what is it that produces chronic homelessness in society? And of course, it is the normalised nature of poverty, the failure to invest in social and affordable housing that contributes to this. So I want to end with an acknowledgement to our Conservative politician last week in the United Kingdom who said homelessness is a lifestyle choice. I absolutely endorse this idea it's a lifestyle choice. And I want to finish on that. It's a choice of how we organise society. It's not a choice of the individual. That was going to be a really concerning end, wasn't it, Noel? Yeah. It is absolutely a choice, and that's the point I want to make. We can choose to do differently, and we'll do so when we start recognising people's humanity and understanding that affordable housing is a basic piece of infrastructure. It's not something that we should look down upon. It's something that we all need so that we can live collectively together. And living collectively together well is a part of the reason, but the main reason is people can live with dignity as citizens of lives of their own choosing when they have access to a livable income and housing that is safe and affordable. And we do have the capacity to do it. We just need to raise our ambition so our ambition is in line with our wealth and our knowledge. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Parsell. That was great. And because we're here at CHP, we're going to get our bang for our buck and hear you talk some more at our panel. So I really look forward to that. And I really like that framing for us, and we might think about it in our comments around the poverty of ambition and poverty by design. I think they are principles that everybody in this room works by. Now, one of the things I'm most proud of at Council to Homeless Persons is we have always led by using experts that have lived experience. We say they are the experts in homelessness. They are the people that can tell us what is working and what is not working. And we've really got the privilege today of being able to run a lived experience panel. And it is my pleasure to introduce Renato Langiu, who will facilitate our first discussion panel today. And he is the Inclusive City Program Officer for the City of Hobart, and he's been in that role since January 2023. And his main responsibilities are in housing and homelessness and LGBTIQA+ commitment delivery. So on that note, we're very lucky to have you. So I look forward to you introducing the lived experience panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm not surprised that you can spell my name with your name, right? Well, welcome to Hobart, everyone, and welcome to whoever is joined online to this Parity launch. Thanks to Council to Homeless Person for organizing the Parity launch in Tasmania. It is a great opportunity for our community to have such an important conversation down here in Hobart. I would like to introduce our community members with lived experience. If you can approach and take a seat, and Sam as well. Meanwhile, they are taking seat, I would like to give you a bit of background about the Housing with Dignity Reference Group. So the Housing with Dignity Reference Group was a group formed in February 2019 by the City of Hobart and was comprising some community members and elected members and employees of the City of Hobart. The purpose of this group was to give a voice and give the opportunity to people with lived experience to be heard. And I think since then, we create several projects. Probably the most successful is I'm Somebody, which has been the third edition this year, and Stage to Stage, where people with lived experience, artists with lived experience, they were able to participate and perform on stage and be creative. We have we're supposed to have 5, but we only have 4 because Tyson couldn't make it. He's renewing his license today. So we have Sam and we have Liana Barrett from Lansetton, Malachi, well known as Zero, and Curtis. Curtis is also the co-chair of the Housing with Dignity Reference Group. They all have different backgrounds. They are great experience to tell. And I'm pretty sure we can have a beautiful and powerful conversation. Thanks for the previous speakers. I think it's really hard for me to even summarize the great conversation that we had. But back to poverty, I would like to say, what are the roots of poverty to you? And considering the today audience, what would you like to bring to the conversation? There you go.
Yeah, so really addressing on the themes that have already been talked about this morning. I chose to go in poverty. It was a choice. And I chose it because I hadn't found my place in society. I'm highly educated. Got postgraduate studies. I've got honours in artificial intelligence and robotics, which I generated over 20 years ago. I've got a Bachelor of Science. I've got a botanical major. I've worked in over 50 different, by the age of 30, I'd had over 50 different jobs all around the world. I was awarded in the Australian Army. And I chose to step into poverty. Because as a leadership coach and a mentor for business owners and executives and other people in society, I needed to be able to lead by example. By example, I need to step into that position to understand where my mind would go with that lived experience of homelessness. I didn't have a home. I could have gone into a corporate job, but I chose not to because I felt there was something that was happening out there in the system that wasn't working. And at that point in time, I didn't know what my role was in my life or what I would do, but I felt this deep desire inside of me to actually to help others through experience, because that's one of the issues that I see is one of the policies that we've been talking about have been created by people that haven't had the lived experience. Which is why it's been beautiful to join this group and to share my experiences with other people who've had the same experience and for us to be able to share our experiences with other people in the community. So that's all I have to say right now.
Thanks, Sam. Curtis, I think your experience is totally different. You are not, wasn't a choice.
No, mine was a series of very unfortunate circumstances. So for me, I ended up in the position of homelessness after the major floods in northern New South Wales. So I lost my home and everything that I'd worked for on the floods, much like many people with New South Wales and Queensland. My home was also then looted, and by the time I come back after going away with my son for the weekend, everything was gone. Then looking at recovery centres, I also faced the issue of such a high influx of workload that I became lost within the system and just became a number. It took over a year for my documents to be replaced. During that time, I moved to Tasmania with a friend who was trying to provide support. We had a fallout. I then ended up in a legal debacle, which I'm still going through now. And when that happened, I was pushed out onto the street, and I was told then at that time by the police, it's not our problem, sort it out yourself. So that's kind of where my homelessness ended up here. It's been probably about going on 15 months now that I'm facing this legal debacle. I spent time staying on the street, and I brought this up talking to Cameron before. I went through a bit of an issue with sleeping in my car and getting a massive amount of fines and not having anywhere to go, and eventually I got those fines removed. I then stayed at a crisis shelter for a number of time, but even then getting any sort of supports from any systems was near on impossible because of all the red tape of them. the information that I would have to provide from one service to another was not sufficient, and it was kind of, well, it's not my job from one service and the same problem from the other. I've been caught in the middle. So even this week, after nearly 15 months, I finally got a referral to see a psychologist. So even to go through that point of PTSD and all my other issues, I've still got Tanley breathing down my neck going, we're going to cut you off because you won't fill out the paperwork the way we want it filled out. And it's like, well, I've spoken to a GP and I have to go through this process, these policies that GPs have to follow. And that does not account for the way that the service such as Centrelink wants things filled out. So it's quite a difficult experience, as why I sort of stepped into the role of advocating for homelessness and the experiences that happens amongst like all the great services that are provided across Australia. It doesn't account for individual experience, nor does it care too much for it. Because of the way that things are strictly done in the system, it completely avoids individual. And unfortunately, I've actually seen a number of people that haven't made it, that have actually lost their lives along this way. And even trying to get help myself through this, I was told at the hospital, oh, don't be fucking silly, pardon my language, and kicked back out on the street. We're not a homeless shelter, we're not here to, it's not our issue, go find someone else. So it's a consistent problem with the high influx and services that are unavailable to deal with mental health issues generally caused by the system. So it's my experience.
Thank you. I wanted to link to Cameron when you were talking about the community and where the change should start instead of talking about the government. Malika, we had a conversation previous this week about community-based spaces and how to build resilience and trying to hand poverty to the community. Would you like to say something?
Absolutely, I'm very keen to speak about this. Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Malika. For those of you who don't know me, I'm also known as Zero. So I'm an artist and I'm a musician. I participated in the I Am Somebody art exhibition. I also participated in the Street to Stage Battle of the Bands. I'm a graduate of a Bachelor of Psychological Sciences, and last year I spent 5 months on the streets, sleeping in cars, sleeping in shelters, sleeping on couches, and sleeping in the forest as well, which honestly was the best experience. I'm here today to offer the insight and the wisdom that I have through my experience and through what I've learned. I'm here to talk about solutions. There's been a lot of talk about problems, but there are solutions, and I'd like to offer 3 addressing the core issue of poverty. So it was mentioned that the underlying denominator of all of these issues is poverty. What causes poverty? From what I understand, it's a social issue. How do we address that? Because in a world with strong communities, it is absolutely inconceivable that anyone would ever find themselves in a position where they have nowhere to go. What about family? What about friends? How has society got into such a point of disarray and isolation where people are so on their own? It's tragic. So the solution, the way out that I see, it's not about policies, it's not about governments, it's about people. How do we build stronger communities? I offer 3 suggestions. First and foremost, we can intervene with the intergenerational trauma that is so linked to poverty by offering courses from the university student run to people in positions of struggle. For example, imagine college students who have an interest in going into university, but for whatever reason, they come from an underprivileged background and don't have the education or the knowledge or the social support. What if university students, as a part of their course, could offer their teaching and learning, partner up with a buddy system with a student from school for a year? So a student wants to learn music, they could partner with a student from the con, and that university student could work with them for a whole year, take them into the university and teach them things they could learn. And it would be a very low-cost way to implement social change and the exchange of knowledge right at the core, right at the transition, like help people get into education, seeing knowledge as power, as people as resources, understanding that we can help each other out. That's the first idea. The second idea, and this links to the first, is to have a free trade hub in the center of the city, a space that has couches, kitchens, laundry services, musical instruments, art equipment. Thank you. And this can be a place where people can build organic community. They can meet, they can build connections, and from this, trust is the new currency. That is actually what is needed to end this social crisis, is stronger connections. If we have a free trade space, a hub where people can meet, for whatever reason, open to everyone, for every purpose, then organically communities can form, connections can be built over a couch, over a cup of tea, over a musical instrument jam. And in this space, also free trade services can be offered and exchanged. Again, very low cost because it's people run, people led. Somebody knows how to fix cars, somebody else knows how to fix lights or how to do taxes. This is a new way of thinking about it that I learned from my experiences at the shelter, that what we don't need money. We do not need money. Money is the middleman. We need food, we need water, we need shelter. And for all of these things, all we really need is each other and the ability to cooperate and to trust. So to create a space that facilitates that, can develop that change and help the coming generations. Which leads me to my third solution. Looking to the future, I believe that the economy can transition into nomadicism as a valid way of life. It was mentioned that people are getting fined for sleeping in their cars. This is ridiculous. What about instead of putting so much pressure on the experiences of people living differently, we made nomadicism, for example, van life, a very valid way of life. People could live in their cars, there could be parking spaces, people could put up tents, decriminalize houselessness, elevate it to a legitimate way of life. People over history have lived nomadically, and very validly so. This would also benefit the economy, because if people were traveling around Australia, it would alleviate, and this is a very appealing option to the younger generation that long for adventure, right? Someone could take their trade and their skills all around Australia, living in their car, and there would be knowledge and exchange of skills and trade going everywhere. It would alleviate the burden from the housing, because we don't need a bunch of people, singles, living in small isolated boxes. This is a problem of social housing in that it doesn't solve the problem because it's still social isolation. So we could have housing targeted at families, at people that actually benefit from having a home. Meanwhile, decriminalizing and allowing nomadicism to flourish, that can help have an alternative style of life. Looking even further into the future, there is a real benefit to this, because with rising sea levels, we're going to experience more pressure on the housing market as coastal villages, coastal towns are put underwater. We've got millions of people that are going to be displaced. How do we account for that? What if already in place was a structure that enabled large groups of people to move all around the world? Travel is no longer something for the elite, and houselessness is no longer something just for people experiencing poverty. It's a valid way of life. We can have a culture, a global citizenship that is reflective of what we're now seeing on social media, on digitization of the world, faster exchange, more communication. We can facilitate that. And so underlying all of these three solutions is the simple realization that we the people don't need the government to help us. We don't need it to be solved. We simply need to be able to work with one another and trust one another. We need less government interference. We need less criminalization of people that are experiencing struggle, so that if the government could just back off a little bit, people will be able to solve these issues on their own. We need to be able to trust that given the opportunity, people will do the right thing by themselves and others. It's fundamental, having empathy and trust as the real currency, coming back to understanding that we're all one people. It's not an economic issue, it is a social issue. And we need to address that at the core by facilitating stronger communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we had a conversation a little bit, and I think just linking to even what Monica just said, education is probably one of the topics that we should address to this crowd today. And you are kind of an expert in this domain.
Well, not really. My actual history, I don't know a time when I have not lived in some form of poverty. I come from the good old generational abuse, neglect, all the stuff that goes on here in Tasmania. We have Aboriginal ancestry that was hidden from us until we were teenagers. I don't know where to start. I am an RN, or was an RN. In the end, the first few episodes that I had of homelessness were from my parents' marriage breaking down and family violence, I guess you could say. Not all perpetrators are men. Then sort of later in life, it was my own marriage breakdown and trying to navigate housing booms, property booms. Even though I was an RN, it coincided with all property booms, so I was never able to catch up, let alone get ahead. And I left Tasmania in the 90s with one child, trying to escape that cycle because, as I was saying, like it's your community. When you're surrounded by a toxic community, you just can't. You can't do anything. So once I removed myself from that, that's when I went on to uni and whatnot, but still it was impossible. So I came home because this is where I belong. And then tried very hard to do as well. But the LGH is the LGH. And that was the final straw. So I finally broke. I have PTSD upon PTSD. And I think a large factor that could help children, I think a lot of the problem is the lack of care and protection of children for many, many, many generations. As well as, there's the, what do you call it, the
Intergenerational trauma.
yes, and prejudice or bias, stigma. Yeah, so growing up, not knowing that you've got like a touch of the tar brush, as they'd say, things like that. Is that why I never got picked for anything? Is that why I was, last in at school all the time? I don't know. But and even led to my own family and even family from that line. I had short naked sides until I was old enough to start growing my hair so that my curls wouldn't show. But yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities for schools to identify kids that are struggling, the kids that hang back, the kids that never do their homework, don't have, they forget their excursion money or their lunch. It was all very similar when I was raising my own children when they were small, but rather than put them through that, I would just keep them home on a sick day. Yeah, because sometimes, you might have things at home that you can give them for lunch, but you can't actually pack it up and send it with them. So, yeah. Sorry, my train of thought comes and goes, I'm sorry. Yeah, family violence is a huge issue. And also I took part in the literacy consultation with DPAC I'm a community voice partner with TASCOSS as well. The 50% of Tasmanians do not have functional literacy. It's hard. I don't know how a person. See, I'm lucky because I lost my mind, but I've still got my literacy. And I'm trying to use that for people who don't have that way of communicating. And I do not know how they navigate Centrelink or anything, housing. everything, you know, anything that's go and sit on that computer. How do you do that? Like, and now we have the migrant community as well who are just lumped in here. A lot of the community believes that they come and take our homes and our jobs, but they're just kind of lumped here and left. And they have to navigate all of these computer systems as well. So, and it's that culture. I can't really speak of. Well, I lived in Western Australia for a long time, and it was not great over there. But Tasmania is its own special thing with shitting on children, and you just can't grow up as a what do you call it? A confident, productive person. You know, when that is ingrained in you. Am I answering the question?
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
You can, yeah.
I'm sorry, but this is the first time I've done anything like this.
Well, the point is to start a conversation about the experience and show to the crowds what is needed and what your experience is. Because we all talk about public housing issues. We all know that the issue is there, but we hardly hear the voice from people with lived experience, and that's the opportunity to tell the service providers what do we want, what do we need to change, how can we change poverty. So you get into the point.
Okay. Well, yeah, I do have one really thing that really has impacted my family over the last few years. When some children go through unspeakable trauma overnight. Some are just like, I have a family member who was actually removed from a bedroom window so that they wouldn't go past a crime scene. Initially, an Airbnb was booked in another town for the survivors, but once the perpetrator was caught, they were on their own. They couch surfed for 3 months, and they were given. They just left with their night clothes on, or you know, just whatever, you know. They just so and there is a thing where children can't access or can't be given trauma counselling until they have a stable home. And alongside that, the surviving parent or the parent, you know, the custodial parent at the time is investigated, which is just wrong. That, you know, but people, they receive a bundle of clothes and necessities, and this is where the dignity came in for me, because a 14-year-old young girl was provided with emergency clothing, but it was too small and it was skimpy, and I really felt terrible for that. Also, if the child happens to be neurodiverse, it compounds it. But they were not given, they cannot access the counselling and support that they need until they've got a stable home. They did not get a stable home for approximately 4 months, but were couch surfing, just couch surfing for 3 months.
Sam?
Sorry.
No, there's no need for sorry at all. What we're pointing to here is really one of the biggest issues, which we discovered in a meeting on Monday. We sat down as a group and we chatted about this event today and what we're going to talk about. And as I said before, I chose to be homeless and I chose to go into poverty. And what happened was that it was actually the best decision I ever made, because I became ostracised. I became ostracised by my friends and my family. And it forced me to look at my traumas. It forced me to deal with my own traumas because the services weren't out there. The support from the community was not out there to help me with my issues. And everyone's got their issues. Because I've healed my wounds, I've now fallen onto my path. And now the world is starting to see me for who I am. Now I've got some uniqueness about me. It's just the same with everyone else here. Everyone has uniqueness and beauty, but it comes out in different ways. And that's what our trauma is related to. So the more that we can accept each other for our uniqueness and our individuality, rather than discriminating and segmentating, we can come together as a group, and that's when we become a force and we can overcome any power.
Thank you. I think we have 1 minute. Go for it.
I just wanted to respond to what you're saying, as you really illustrated the absolute necessity for there to be more support for children. Because if we can help the generation that is coming into these problems, if we can give them a better chance, that's how we stop the intergenerational trauma, the cycle of poverty. And education has a golden opportunity to do that.
Yes.
University students buddy up with high school students.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can also intervene younger than primary schools, and maybe what about teaching teachers to be on the lookout for this kind of stuff, and also implementing more health conscious programs in school, things like mindfulness meditation, yoga, healthy eating, all of those kinds of things, just to give people a chance to actually you know, help them with themselves, you know?
And even a little bit of education on human rights at school, so that children, because we were told how lucky we were. You know, you don't know how bloody lucky you are, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, and it was only, you know, as you get older and learn from friends and other, you know, I was very, very keen observer of other people's parents. Then you start to think, oh, hang on a minute. But, you know, because if children can identify within themselves that what is happening at home is probably not okay.
Yeah.
And also that they're safe to say if it is. And the world's not just going to go bang on them. And definitely not sent home with the perpetrator after they have spoken up. Yeah, that was another thing we went through. But yeah, and sorry, this is one last thing. Teachers are like a lottery. You can have, yes, and the ones that just punish children for living in poverty, for being withdrawn, you know, being smelly, scungy, they need to be weeded out.
Well, it's really hard to summarize all these very interesting points. I think you can ask more questions during the other conversation. I'm pretty sure there is an open session at the end, probably. But we only have 30 minutes at the moment, so we need to pass that then to the other. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much. I always find the lived experience panels to be incredibly powerful, and I think it's a really, particularly for people who are hanging around neighbours who say, how does this happen? You realise that it's actually multi-dimensional about how people end up experiencing poverty. So once again, thank you so much. And I really love the solutions as well. So I've written those down.
Great.
Now, our second session consists of 2 speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Heather Holst. Very lucky as a Victorian to be able to say that this is the first jurisdiction ever that appointed a commissioner for residential tenancies, and that was in 2018, and you became the first rental commissioner in the country. Heather has got it to be that long, so I'm not going to go through that considering the time. Just take it from me and trust me that she has got a lot of expertise in this area and is going to now talk to us around the intersect of poverty and housing. Thank you very much, Dr. Heather.
Thank you, Deborah, for the great introduction, and what a fantastic conversation that you're really opening up there with the lived experience panel. So first, a quick acknowledgement of pay my respects to the country, to the elders, traditional owners of the countries that we're living on today. I'm mainly going to talk to you about private rental today, because in a quick word association, most people think of public and community housing as equating to poverty. But if you wanted to find out where most people in poverty are living, you'd be looking at rental. It's also kind of very next to homelessness. It's often where you fall out of housing and into homelessness, and for many of us who get back from that, it's often into private rental actually. So they're really, really adjacent. I wanted to mainly focus on it today. So my background is mainly in homelessness. So I started as a volunteer after having a really bad landlord in a long time ago, 1989, when the first baby was at home, and went off and volunteered at the Tenancies Union, and we did get the bond back. But I've worked in homelessness mostly since then. The commissioner role, I'll talk very briefly about because it's a bit of a mystery, but the point is the Victorian government made this appointment to hear from and make sure that the voices of renters get into the policy-making process in Victoria. So that's my role actually, is to be listening, taking advice and making sure that where I can, that's plugged in to the policy-making. One really interesting thing Malachi Zero said was don't go with government. The trust needs to be built among the people. Government is made of people, and make sure they hear from you too. So that's what I want to say to you. And there are a lot of well-meaning people in government who find themselves not well equipped enough, not informed enough, or constrained in what they can do. But I just want to say keep working there too. Yeah. So look, renting. So I think it was Bronwyn who said before that it's become a very hot issue, and many of us will have noticed this with our issues, that it takes a long time for everyone else to notice something that's been going on for a very long time. And the fact is that a lot of people now who are renting, who are on quite high incomes, are experiencing some of the incredible downsides that lower income renters have known about for a really long time. That you might get an eviction notice at any time because the owner wants to sell the property. In Australia, most owners invest in rental property for the capital gain. That's actually why you do it, because you don't really derive, in most cases, an income off the rental. Pop that into the bank for the mortgage, and then you owe them a bit more, which some of you get off the tax office, but not all of it. So actually, selling the house when the market's going up is very, very rational. But of course, it's awful for the person living in it. This has been experienced, lower and upper incomes now, and the incredible destabilisation of that. I spoke to someone the other day who always had great jobs, who was saying they'd been knocked back for a couple of rental applications, and they were really affronted by that. Fancy that. So that's that is becoming a much more general experience up the income spectrum. Now that's bad, but it's also frankly quite good for the issue if there's more people. I think you were talking about solidarity, getting together on things, making common cause. So the more people in the issue, the worse it is, but it does make for a bigger group who are agitated for things to change. So look, the threat of poverty and homelessness is absolutely linked to rental housing. And anyone in rental housing knows that, or who's trying to get into it. And the threat of it, and Tanya Farnhar in her piece in the Great Edition of Parity that's Noel's once again put together, has talked about this, the economic abuse side of things, the holding over of you won't be able to keep living here, where are you going to live? If you don't do what I want you to, where are you going to go? And where are you going to go with your kids? So housing, private rental housing especially, can be a tool in that sort of economic abuse that makes poverty all the sharper for people. I've spoken to many women over the years who, after a breakdown of, family violence, the whole breakdown of things, may be in sort of stable social housing again, but they feel that they lost their children, their home. So that kind of legacy of that really goes on. So I just wanted to say how important, I know I'm preaching to convert here, but that element of economic abuse with poverty as the weapon is in place. John Falzon in his piece, I really recommend that piece to you in the Parity, it's absolutely amazing. Talks about that you don't have a poverty problem so much as a wealth problem in Australia, and this is all relational. It's something you're talking about a bit too, Cameron. Hey? Yeah. So, so the fact that housing is one of the key ways that ordinary people can sort of create wealth, if you like, but then it can get sort of go beyond that and become, you know, a way to get richer, and other people, frankly, become poorer is something that John talks about in his piece, and I think that's marvellous. I want to talk specifically about some things that Victoria's just announced. I don't know who's heard of the Victorian Housing Statement that came out in September. Victorians have probably had a look at it. It's pretty comprehensive. Cameron and I were talking just before, you never get everything you want as an advocate, but there are quite a few things in there that I think are going to go some way towards getting some things better. And so I wanted to just run through quickly some of the private rental sides of that statement. I wanted to sort of interest you in it enough that you will go and look at it. And if you're in another state or territory, I would, you know, suggest that that's something that you might be able to use as well to make some arguments with your own policymakers, because this has also come out of the federal government now being much more interested in fairer housing and saying to the states and territories, here are the pieces of work we want everyone to be doing, come back to us with what you're going to do. So there is an opportunity, colleagues, to actually do some of this, and announcements are starting to be made in WA, for example, and in Queensland, South Australia, about these sort of things too. So what Victoria is suggesting, specifically in the private rental part of it, if you receive an eviction notice after your first term of tenancy, you can get an eviction notice after your first term for no reason. We wanted that out, but it isn't out. What they've done instead is said the next person who goes in must go in at least the same rent. They can't go in at higher rent. So this is an attempt to start to put some downward pressure on rents. All types of rent bidding are now banned. They attempted this in 2018, but what's the change now is that you can't accept a rent bid. So before you could say, oh look, I didn't solicit a rent bid, they just gave me more. So now you can't accept that. So that's another one that's trying to kind of keep this bidding war on rents a bit more under control. There's going to be the establishment of a new dispute resolution service, with the idea being that renters will be more readily able to get their disputes heard quickly and fairly, because at the moment we've got a lot of people are very nervous about taking a dispute forward, and then they know that there's likely to be a wait time as well. So it's going to that. We're going to introduce what's called a portable rent bond scheme, because one of the big problems is when you're trying to get into a new place, you might have been accepted into it, but how do you find, if you haven't got any spare money, how do you find the rent in advance and the bond while you're still waiting for the last bond to be returned? So it's trying to smooth that very real problem of a couple of thousands of dollars that can prevent people moving where they need to. There's going to be an extension of the notice of rent increase period. So at the moment it's 2 months. You can be given a rent increase notice. It'll be extended to 90 days. And other notice to vacate periods will also be extended by that extra month. These are small things, but hopefully the idea is to help people have a bit more time to withstand and prepare for what they need to do there. There'll be mandatory training and licensing for real estate agents and property managers introduced, because the reports back, and I bet people here could give me a few reports back, are that there's some very poor practice out there, and that really, really bears out on private renters. There'll be stuff there to make the rental application process easier, and that renters' information is better protected too, because at the moment we're giving a lot over, we don't know what it's being used for, and exactly how that's all stored, whether there's data breaches, quite apart from how am I being selected or not. Yeah, so that's the Victorian parts on private rental. I would recommend them to you. Look, just a few last things. Private rental housing can cause other costs to be much higher too. That's very pertinent if you're low income and poverty situation. So there's a recent Hurry report's just come out. Edgar Liu has written it about poverty in Australian housing that I'd recommend to you as well. And it finds that less accessible locations and the higher transport costs, you know, whether that's petrol or fares, materially increasing the costs that people have to pay. There are higher utility costs when there's lower standard homes. The switch to solar, which is happening in a lot of Australian homes, is incredibly lagging in private rental properties. And that's a really important way not only to reduce emissions, which we've all got to be getting on with, but also to reduce the bills. There's been incentives in Victoria for several years now, trying to incentivise landlords to actually make those installations. Incredibly low take up of it, and that means that the bills stay high. And frankly, they're moving more often because private renters move more often. That's just how it is. The last time there was a check-in on this a couple of years ago, the average move cost was around $2,000 extra. I'm going to say that would be higher now. So there's a couple of thoughts about the Nexus with private rental, poverty and homelessness. Just a couple of thoughts about what is to be done. Now, I think it was Bronwyn, was it, who said this was a problem decades in the making, and actually it's going to be decades in the fixing. We're going to have to keep at this for decades, and we're going to have housing statement type of actions year on year from all levels of government. And it's very good to see Hobart City Council here as well, because you know, that's all part of it. But we could do some things quickly. Look, Cameron, I'm with you. We don't fiddle, but you know, let's not find people for sleeping in their cars. You know. And you know, let's address some of the associated costs there are with private rentals, such as those utility shock bills. You know, the moving price, for example, all those things. We have to be sure that in income measures, whether that's the you know, the fair wage cases or for minimum wage or the Centrelink rate, really knows about what people are trying to do who are renting, and that sort of information is taken into account and is powerful in those decisions that are made about those income measures. We need to keep working on supply, and a lot of this Victorian statement is about supply side stuff actually, and we need to make sure that that supply is actually for the people who are on the lower incomes and need it, rather than just supply in general. And we just have to get to the point where housing isn't one of the kind of main ways that wealth and poverty are created and perpetuated, including in discriminatory behaviour towards certain groups, such as Aboriginal applicants or you know, new arrivals as well. So they're just a few thoughts from my current position, and I will listen with interest to the rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Heather, for that, and thanks for all your advocacy piece around the housing statement. I mean, I do think in terms of rental, that was really the big winner in that statement, as opposed to social and public housing, but any downward pressure that you can put on rental increases. So at Council of Homeless Persons, we had someone with lived experience call us on income support with 2 high needs children, saying that her rent had gone up $500 a month. I mean, this sort of stuff is just unsustainable. So the fact that you've put that pressure and the idea that there'll be legislative reform, I think is a credit to you for that advocacy piece. Thank you so much. So our second speaker is Matt Lloyd-Cape, who is going to focus on housing cost, poverty and homelessness. So that'll actually be a nice way to continue this conversation. Matt is the Director of Equitable Housing at Per Capita, so part of the think tank. And I'm just looking at the time, and once again, I know all your policy and research extends quite in quite a lengthy way, but if you don't mind, I'm just going to introduce you to come and deliver your thoughts to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Cut to the chase.
Yeah.
I've got a presentation which I will try to the keyboard screen. All right. Try to get going here. I'm a bit of a numbers nerd, so I'm going to talk through some of the trends, these long-term trends that we've been talking about. Help me get this going.
You want to full screen?
Yeah, it's not full screen.
On the bottom under the.
Oh yeah, just it. Great. Thanks so much. It's been some fantastic discussions and thoughts shared so far today. My colleague Lucy Tonkin and myself wanted to write a piece kind of reflecting a lot of what Cameron said actually, so forgive me for repeating things less eloquently than has already been said, but hopefully the numbers will be useful for people to get an idea of some of these structural causes around housing costs and its relationship to poverty. I wanted to start with a quote. Oops. Okay. We are missing the quote. Okay, I want to start with a quote from the British Home Secretary, Swallow Braverman, who said a couple of days ago, in a bid to get the sale of tents to homeless people banned. This was her policy for ending tent living in the UK, that the UK government should ban the sale of tents to homeless people. And she said, many people come here, often from abroad, you know, she wanted to throw in a bit of racism as well, to take up the lifestyle choice of rush sleeping in tents on our streets, and that's not acceptable. And I think what this shows is the extreme end of what happens when we don't look at structural causes of homelessness and poverty and the associated housing costs that cause both of those things. Her government's overseen the largest rise of homelessness in the UK in history. It's the largest in the European Union as well. And she wanted to divert the attention to individuals and blame individuals rather than look at some of those structural causes. So that's kind of the extreme end of where that approach can get us. But we know that obviously homelessness, poverty, and housing costs have an intimate relationship. If you're homeless, you are far more likely to be in poverty and less likely to be able to afford your housing costs. If your housing costs go up, then your chance of falling into poverty go up, and therefore your risk of homelessness, and so on. So it's a very tight relationship between those three. The cause of pressure on costs, housing costs for low-income households in Australia that leads them into poverty can be seen very clearly here. This is the trend of housing costs for different wealth quintiles of Australians. So this, can I get this? Okay. So this is a new bit of text for me here. All right, so this top line here, this top blue one, that's the lowest 20% of wealth owners in Australia. The light blue one down the bottom, that's the richest 20% of Australians. You can see here in 1999, the amount of housing costs as a proportion of income is pretty tightly, there was kind of a fairly tight relationship between the richest and the poorest in Australia. By the time you get through to 2016, you've got the lowest 20% of people in Australia in terms of wealth. Their costs of housing is more than doubled, or roughly doubled, from around 15–16% to 30% of their incomes. Whereas for the richest two bands, their housing costs have barely budged in terms of the proportion of their income. And what this shows really is that while we like to focus on the individual and their pathway into poverty and homelessness, we do need to look at these big structural trends as well. Another way of looking at it is to look at how much people's incomes has changed over time, before their housing costs and after their housing costs are accounted for. So in this graph, we've split the country into 10 groups. Well, it's not us, it's someone else that did it. But here you've got the lowest 10% of people by wealth at this end, and then the richest people up here, 10% up here. And what we've done is you've got in the blue bars, you've got how much people's incomes have changed between 1989 and 2016. And you can see that for, obviously, the trend is that people on lower wealth categories have had lower income growth over the years. whereas people at the top have had a fair bit of income growth. But if you look at those gold bars, that's how much people's income increase is left after you've taken out housing costs. So for the people in the bottom 10% of the country, in terms of wealth and income, around half of all of the income gains between 1989 and 2016 have been eradicated due to increasing housing costs. Whereas for the top end of town, the housing cost effect is far lower, just a few percent here and there. Now, why is this happening? Obviously, we know that a big part of the story is that house prices are growing far faster than incomes. In this graph, we have in the orange bar, that's the growth of house prices, and in the blue bar, that is people's income growth. And you can see that up until around the mid-90s, there's a fairly tight relationship between the two trends. And then in the mid-90s and the noughties, when we introduced the CGT discount, when we reintroduced negative gearing, and when we changed landlords' mortgage requirements to be much more close to owner-occupier mortgages, you have an explosion of investment into the housing market by investors rather than owner-occupiers, and that's shoved house prices way out of reach of wages. Now, if you go back to the 1975 poverty report, it's a really seminal poverty report, they talked about how we had far more before housing poverty than after housing poverty. What that means is that because we had a protective layer of social housing for low-income households, and because we had high ownership rates, particularly of pensioners, we had a protection system built into our housing system that dragged people out of poverty. Now, what's happening as house prices are going up is that the proportion of people able to own a home is declining, particularly for young people. So this graph's kind of confusing, but it's a good one. So what we've got is people's birth cohort. So this gold bar up the top, that is people born between 1947 and 1951. So by the time someone born between 1947 and 51 was 25, around 54% of them owned a house. And by the time you get to by the time they reach the age of 65 to 69, 83% of them own a house. Now, what we're seeing is that generationally, every generation, this is my generation here, people born between 82 and 86, this blue bar, only 42% of them owned a house by the time they were 25 to 29. And what this means is that that protective layer of home ownership means that far more people will be entering their retirement years with a mortgage or in the private rental market. They'll be far more likely to end up in poverty because of those housing costs. So we're stripping at that top layer of protection from society. I'm kind of quoting from Thomas Piketty here, capital is back in the housing market. If you want to get in, you need to have the right kind of family, increasingly. This comes from a survey that we did back in the early part of the year. And we asked homeowners, did you get help from your mum and dad when you bought a house? Now, if you bought your house prior to 1981, which is over here, it's around 15% of people said, yes, I've got financial support from my family. By the time you get to 2000, people buying 2000 or after, it's around 40 or more % of people getting help from their family. Now, this builds in and replicates all kinds of inequalities that we already have, and some that we've eradicated previously, such as, in this case, gender inequality. So here we have men is the blue line, women is the gold line. So the share of men that get help from their parents to buy a house is significantly higher and growing compared to those of women. Now, we get asked about this a lot, and we don't have like a firm answer for why this would be. One of the reasons we think is that, you know, our cultural preference in Australia and Western society is that, you know, we still have a vestige of dowry systems in that the father of the bride, the parents of the bride, is more likely to pay for the wedding. So parents might be giving each of their kids, you know, their son and their daughter, an equal amount of money, but for the daughter it goes to the wedding, for the son it goes to buying a house. And obviously one is consumed entirely in one day, and the other pot of money grows into retirement. So by pushing the price of house up and requiring more and more capital to be involved, we're actually pushing the chance of migrants, of Indigenous Australians and women, pushing their chance of home ownership downwards as well. Another obviously critical factor here is our decline in social housing investment. So we've taken the census data on the left here, and this is the share of all renters who are public renters, or social renters, back in the day, public renters. So you can see here, the late 80s, early 90s, around 1 in 4 renters was a public renter, and were protected by fixed rents and decent tenure. By the time we get to now, we're down to around 1 in 10 renters are public renters. So a complete collapse, really, of our public housing system. We currently have, 170,000 people on the waiting list, households on the waiting list. And what this does when it comes to effects on housing costs is that we've gone from the average low-income renter spending 26% of their income on rent, up to around 33% today, as they're pushed into the private rental market, which is a totally inappropriate place for low-income renters to be. More drivers, obviously we need to talk about wages. Wages growth has been very slow for many years. We've had 5 years of this doesn't show it particularly well, but 5 years of very average wage growth. And then real wages have absolutely collapsed in this inflationary period. So people's incomes, particularly low-income households, are being smashed right now. And that's not helped by our decline in unemployment benefits. So here you can see, unemployment benefits and in their relationship to poverty lines. And we went along, chugging along very disappointingly until COVID, and then we lifted everybody on job seeker out of poverty for a very brief period, and now we're back down to slightly above $300. So many drivers. What this, I guess, one other thing, if I've got time. Yep. Yeah. One other thing that we, as policy wonks and policy makers, need to really consider is when we look at sort of averages and medians. We often look at things like consumer price index for inflation. Now, the consumer price index is made up of an average basket of goods, so housing costs seem to be around 23% of the average Australian spending. Now, everyone in this room will know very well that that's not right and not true for people in the lower income and wealth categories. So here I've split out average spending into thirds. I split the country into thirds of low, middle, and high wealth groups. And you can see that the effect for your average spending is that low-income groups are spending more than double on housing. Now, the CPI is the government's main measure for seeing how everyone's going in many ways. And what they're not seeing is the distributional effects and how poor people are being smashed much harder under inflationary times than other people. I think Cameron and others have really summed up the issues very clearly. But what we've seen over this period that I've been trying to talk about from the 90s to now is that we've had a fragmentation of our understanding of the housing system. We've had a fragmentation of our policy architecture. So right now, the Department of Social Services is producing their National Housing and Homelessness paper, their consultation paper, which was woefully lacking in drawing the connections between different parts of our housing system, and the fact that you don't end homelessness by only doing homelessness programs. You have to address the entire housing market. So what we need to see first off is a clear diagnosis of the structural causes of housing stress, unaffordability, and homelessness. This was done beautifully in 1945 when the government first set out the Commission for Housing, a 1,000-page document documenting all of the issues leading to poor housing outcomes, everything from mortgage setting through to local council decision making. what we've got at the moment is the government that's trying to push their housing policy into a very small parcel, which is housing and homes and services separate from the entire housing market, which just is not going to solve the problem. So what that means is we need to join up a national strategy that incorporates all these different areas of housing policy. And fundamentally what we need to see now, and what we all need to be pushing for as advocates, is for the government to go back to the drawing board with their National Housing and Homelessness Plan, which is completely inadequate and inappropriate, and start from some moral positions. And I'll maybe just finish up with a moral position. Okay, I don't know why, but this won't let me show my quote slides, which I have scattered through the presentation. It was a quote from the original Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, which was that, let me see if I can do it from memory. It is not only it is the right of every Australian to a dwelling of decent, affordable and secure housing. Whether they are renters or owners, they should not be paying undue profits to unfair owners. Something along those lines. I'm not sure why it's taken my slides out, but there you go. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. I know I've noticed on the chat that there are quite a few questions there, but what I think I'll do is just push on to the next, our third and final panel discussion, and then we can do the questions at the end of that. So the next panel discussion looks at, can we end homelessness? I think we can all think about whether poverty is the only driver of homelessness. I think everyone in this room has got a pretty strong view of that. So the panel will, everyone who is on the panel, if you can make your way here, I'll do the introductions as we go. And we're looking at, can ending poverty end homelessness? So this terrific panel is being facilitated by Dr. Kathleen Flanagan, and Kathleen is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Tasmania. Her research focuses on inequality, disadvantage and marginalisation, including the housing market, and on the history of welfare policy in Australia. So thank you very much. And Professor Cameron Parsell is already known to you. No doubt he's coming back for a second go, so that's good. And for those who don't know Adrienne Picone, she's part of the POS family. Once in the POS family, always in the POS family, so that's wonderful. So the CEO of TASCOSS, which is fantastic. And we have Dr. Cynthia Townley, who's a policy officer at Shelter Tasmania. Thank you very much. And Amelia Natoli, who is from the Salvation Army Public Relations Secretary for Tasmania. Thank you. Over to you, Kathleen. Thanks.
That chair, actually. Hi, everybody. I consider my role in this to get out of the way and let these other people talk. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask them first to give me their elevator pitch answer to the question that we're discussing in the panel. And then we will proceed to unpack that. I'm very bad at timekeeping, so I can wave vigorously if needed. So I might as well just go onwards. Elevator pitch. Elevator pitch.
So would ending poverty and homelessness? I have to say no. It will go a really long way and do a great deal of good. And yes, let's do it. But there's some other structural issues and barriers that you would need to consider. Obviously, supply, which we've heard a little bit about. But if the homes in a material sense aren't there, the money's not going to buy them, right? So you've got to do supply. You need a supply of affordable, appropriate, safe, secure housing that's got the qualities and characteristics that meet people's needs, proper location, right number of bedrooms, all of those important things. They also need to be secured for residential homes, right? You can't have the properties out there and then give them to visitors for short accommodation. That would be a footnote to that one. We need fair access, right? So you can have money, but you can be excluded from the private rental market for all kinds of reasons. You're a non-preferred tenant by certain people because, oh, I don't know, discrimination in various ways. It might be ageism, it might be racism, it might be attitudes about culture or religion, it might be attitudes about ableism. There's all kinds of reasons why your large family might not be appealing to people, or your family structure because you had non-traditional sexuality, family grouping. So fair access is going to be fundamental too. Poverty will not solve all the problems of justice that are here. It compounds them, makes them worse, but it's not the complete story. And I suppose the third thing among what could be a very long list, and you can read all about it in Cameron's book if you need to, and I recommend that book, and the addition of Parity. But the other one is there are other dimensions of prevention that need to be in play. Family violence, as we heard, people can be cast out of a family situation, and that's not just about poverty, right? It's about many things. Might be the financial or economic abuse within that household. Some of the people might have access to financial resources or not. The average income of the household doesn't tell you anything about who gets access and power. Also, in terms of families, particularly, but not only for young people, you've got all those issues about people's parents or guardians having certain attitudes about those young people's identities or sexualities or all kinds of identity markers. Even a religious difference can mean that young person is excluded. Then they face another level of exclusion just based on age, because no one wants to rent to young people because they're untidy or unreliable, or even poor, right? It's hard to house people who don't have a high income. Young people often have much lower incomes, and the system that keeps them poor is that. So there's a whole bunch of things that are structural and need to be addressed in addition to the big one, which is poverty, but it's not the only one. Bing, the other way around.
Absolutely agree. While we don't think that it can end homelessness, we certainly think it could end homelessness as we see it now. So we see a lot of people at the moment who come to us and, we're looking at their budgets, and no matter what we tweak or what we do, we just can't get their income or their income support to meet their everyday expenses. So we're trying to find them potentially a property or help them stay in the one they've got. But the idea of the Salvation Army and other organisations is to be that emergency relief. If something goes wrong and things happen, but when we are every week and every day trying to put the Band-Aid on structural issues, we can't make that change. We can give someone a bit of food, some financial support for the moment, but we know that they're going to be in that same position next week if we can't address things such as how do we bring that income level up? How do we try and make sure that there are affordable and suitable and stable and safe accommodation for people as well? So I've kind of jumped with my notes because everything you've said has radiated as well. But yeah, we've got to look at the supply. So once again, you hit on perfectly that we need to find properties that are suitable, that can make sure we do have places available both in private and community or social market as well. And where are those located? The other thing we're seeing a lot of is if we put those, and I think it got touched on earlier, in places outside of our cities, outside and away from services, what impact does that actually have on the individual and their overall budgets as well? If we see people that are having to drive further, that are disconnected from their local supports and networks, if anyone's tried to get into a GP recently, if you know how long it can take, if you are trying to race across the town to try and get into one that you've seen previously, what cost does that have on petrol? If you've got an older car because you can't afford to buy something newer, you're disproportionately affected by a lot of these increasing costs of living. So look, in closing, as the elevator starts to get closer to my level, we don't think it'll completely fix things, but we think ending poverty would certainly end homelessness as we see it now for many people. Sorry, Adrienne.
Look, I probably would, absolutely concur with what Cynthia and Amelia have already said, and I guess I would probably just add that this is a wicked problem. If we knew the solution to this, we would have solved this problem many years ago. And it is partly about, I would say, in fact, I think ending poverty poverty, it would go a long way to ending homelessness, but it's not, I agree, the only component. And I think it's about a key role for us at TASCOSS. You know, our mission is about changing and challenging the systems, behaviours and attitudes that create poverty, inequality and exclusion. And I think for me, it is partly about systems change, but it is also all about changing those behaviours and attitudes. And I think that will also go a significant way to ending homelessness. If I could just also add, and probably be remiss, because not just to talk about income support, but really I think to me that is just a simple lever that could be pulled that would, if we could increase that rate of job seeker and accommodation assistance, would be a simple lever that we could pull that would go a long way to ending homelessness.
There's an interesting book that was published last year with a brilliant analysis from the United States, which demonstrated that the greatest predictor of homelessness in all cities in the United States was not poverty at all. In fact, many cities that had very, very, very high poverty rates had very, very low rates of homelessness, and cities that had low poverty rates had very high rates of homelessness. And the critical determinant was housing affordability. So what I want to point out is that we can actually end homelessness even if we didn't do anything about poverty. We can have lots and lots of poor people living in affordable social housing if we did it. I don't think we should do that. I think that's a bad idea. But what I think it does, and it resonates with perhaps some things that Zero said, we need to think about what does it even mean if we want to end homelessness, and we have to think about lots of things. We have to think about homelessness not just in the way that it inflicts harm on people's lives. We have to think about when we're talking about what we should do about homelessness, reduce poverty or not, increase affordable housing or not. We're really having a conversation about what do we think society should look like. And simply, we're having a conversation about what do we think we have a collective responsibility for or not. Is it the family's responsibility? Is it charities? Is it the distant states? Or is it all of us based on our shared humanity? So I want to propose that a conversation about what we should do about poverty or homelessness is at the same time a conversation about what society should look like. And what are we as individual citizens, going back to Heather's point that the state government is just a collection of citizens, what do we want to live like together? That's what the conversation is about. And that, what do we want to live like together? This sense of together is always a question about what is another person worth? And sadly, poverty and homelessness, even if implicitly, says that someone else is worth a little bit less, or at least I don't have a responsibility for their worth. And these are things I think we need to challenge.
Can I have a?
You just get back on the elbow.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So I want to complicate that just a fraction.
Please.
Yes, it's true we're all people. Yes, it's true that politicians and governments are people too. But there is a really big difference between those of us who vote and those of us who are in the big decision-making parties. And it reminds me, and this comes back again to the about poverty by design. We're not all equally responsible for those designs. Some of us are beneficiaries, but some of us are really powerfully involved in making those designs. There's wealth by design, and those people who are those decision makers are doing actually, by the way, quite well. Thank you very much from that design. And I want to, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to quote John Howard. We will decide, think about who this we is, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. And I think there is a very important we in that statement. We will decide who is the beneficiary of our policies and who is living in poverty. There's a we there, and it's not a uniform we, it's a segmented we. It is like those income segmentations that Matt showed us. It is like those really important segmentations in the rental market where you might increase your supply, but it's not at the affordable end. There is a segmentation here. I don't know how to put that on clearly. It worries me a little bit when we say, oh, we're all responsible, we're all the community, we can all do these things. There's really, really big structural issues and really, really big powerful vested interests, and some of those pay a really big a lot of money, both while they're in government and when they exit government, by really, really big corporations with really, really big vested interests. And I'm just going to hop out of the elevator now.
A lot of things is about inequality and injustice at so many levels, whether it's access to power or access to resources or access to the ability to make collective decisions about your life.
I think there's also, I think particularly here in Tasmania, there's been a bit of a complacency in our attitudes towards housing and homelessness. And I've actually, when I was thinking about this session, I looked back at the 2019 edition of Parity, and Catherine Robinson, I know I was in the room a while ago, but I think she's gone. I'm sure she's known to you. So she was formerly with Care, and she's now up at UTAS. But the comment that she made in the introduction was in 2019, the innocence of Tasmania in the face of homelessness has now ended, and the struggle with how to understand, articulate and respond to the fact of enduring homelessness in Tasmania has begun. And I think it's about, for me, obviously homelessness, people experienced homelessness before 2019, we all know that. But I think there was a sense of denial for us here in Tasmania that only happened on the mainland, that only happened in Melbourne and Sydney, it didn't actually happen here. So I think that there's a sort of we know that this is a problem that's been decades in the making, but I think particularly in this state, we're only starting to grapple with it and start to come up with some solutions. And I think for me that what that really comes back to is that attitude change, and how we need to address that.
Just to touch on that as well, it surprises us still that people kind of go, oh, Tassie's just getting a homelessness problem, or we're starting to see people experiencing homelessness in our CBDs. We often talk about that visible face of homelessness, but of course there are so many people behind that. I'm not sure if this stat is still up to date, but we often said the one person that you see, there are 13 that you don't. And that mindset that people go, you know, oh, we're not as bad as Melbourne and Sydney, so is it really a problem? If there is one person that is without, I mean, Tassie winters, Tassie any day can be really challenging, knowing everything that comes with having access to a house and the support, the meal, everything that comes with it. We need to do something about it, and that does concern me a little bit, that they often are the people that might be in those rooms that don't see it as a huge issue, that don't think, oh, the community support is behind it, so why are we going to take action on it? Is it going to get us the support we need when it comes to the polls as well? So we try and educate people around it, but yeah, misconceptions as well, and of course the lack of awareness is huge.
And I think for us as a state too, that sort of issue that we've experienced probably over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, where we've, you know, historically had some of the lowest wages in the country, and we've sort of been okay with that because it's been offset by our very low housing costs as well. But, you know, the last 6 years, and particularly with that skyrocketing housing during COVID, we've seen that gap has just become really significant, and I think we're really seeing the impacts of that now.
The average wages in Tasmania are something around $200 a week less than the national average, but the private rental costs are comparable with Melbourne. So last year I think we were about $11 above on the median, and this year I think it's a couple of bucks below, but we're no longer in that place where I think you're absolutely right. We were protected because actually there was cheap rent for a very long time.
And a high level stocked as well. There was a lot of
we didn't have population increase for very long. And so those two things, the structural issues, just really came down. I'm just trying to see if I've got the homelessness statistics from the last census. I'll have something, but
I've got, was it 2,350 people?
Yeah,
2,000.
And it was like 45%.
It was 44.8. So yeah,
120,000 people.
And noticeably more than other stuff.
Oh yeah, if we can jump on that, I'm trying to think of a politician to quote back at Siena, but like all I can come up with was Scott Morrison. We don't have funding we don't have anything for your unfunded empathy. But I think when we're looking across the country at the rates of homelessness, we can think of the 6 states in one territory, and they're essentially far more similar than they are different. But then we have to look at the northern territory, where the rate of homelessness is greater than LA. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever looked at the 8 jurisdictions that we measure it, but essentially, if you think of a graph, it pretty much goes like this, and you turn off the territory, it's about here. I mean, when we're thinking about framing and what people are worth, and when we say what people are worth, we're talking about what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but principally Aboriginal people are worth, and the homelessness statistics in the Northern Territory, we kind of ignore them and we focus on LA. But actually, the rate, best we know, is actually worse in the Northern Territory than Los Angeles, in San Francisco, and other parts of California, which we kind of put up as the poster child as a failed society. And I think that's important for us to reflect upon when we're talking about, you know, our collective work, responsibility, or not.
Mm, yeah.
And we don't, we don't have funding for our in there, it turns out.
Mm. And there is
We don't even have anything going.
Yes.
One thing that I think, like everyone, I was very moved when Liana was talking about children and well, she said it so much more eloquently than I could repeat, but we talk about ending homelessness like it's this big monolithic thing, but actually we know different experiences of homelessness exist. Does anyone have any comments on that kind of, so homelessness could ending poverty, end homelessness for kids, could it end? Is there any group that you would work for?
I was also reflecting on that comments around supports for children, and that really resonated with me. And I was sort of thinking about it almost in, in terms of our health system, for example, where we invest all this money in putting new beds in the hospitals, but actually if we were investing more money into the community health and that early intervention approach, we could be the ones at the top of the cliff rather than waiting for people to fall off the cliff. And I think there's some similarities here, and I think it really does come back. And I think that people during that panel were talking about, more support for children, intervene earlier, more health conscious programs in schools. And I think if we really start to address this issue at that sort of systems level, rather than waiting until people are actually experiencing homelessness, I think that could really go a long way. It is about looking at it in a whole way. Yeah.
We need really strong structures, particularly for families, for larger families. Really difficult when we have a family in a crisis shelter to get them into an appropriate home. The availability of larger bedroom homes for larger families and blended families at an affordable level is just diabolically scarce. And we also know that if the person experiences homelessness as a child or a young person, that is a really, really high risk factor for repeated episodes of homelessness later in life. And one of the things to think about is if we end homelessness, one of the sloganistic ways to think about it is it may not be zero, but what you want to do is you want to say it'll be rare, it's not going to happen to many people, it'll be brief. If it's a moment where you sleep in your car once, but there's somewhere to go, that's a kind of, like there is an emergency response. And it's not repeated. So whatever led to that situation, that individual family or person gets the help they need. If it's a pattern, we change the pattern. If it's structural systemic, we look at changing that. Because all of the patterns and structures that we know exist now, they're going to change. Someone spoke about the climate change impacts of changing patterns of where people live and how people live and all the rest of that. That's going to send us a new set of patterns, and changes that we haven't anticipated are going to do that too, I think. So again, it's not just saying we've got all the systemic drivers now. There may be different ones that we have to pay attention to. But if we can address homelessness, to use a word that you might like, but resolve it, end it, so that it's rare, brief, non-recurring, that's what you have to do. You have to look at those, I think those three elements, probably others.
So perhaps it's not so much different groups of homeless people, but recognising that poverty is, like we have poor systems, we have poor infrastructure.
I think from an early age, like education, I think is actually the theme of Anti-Poverty Week in Tasmania a couple of years ago. And it's come up a couple of times today, but the literacy rates across the state, how are we setting these kids up to do well in life? And of course it can be that we're seeing people who are struggling with their literacy and it impacts them and potentially drives them into poverty or homelessness, but also those kids that are experiencing poverty, what impact does it have on their education now? And is that going to impact them in future years? So what are we doing to address that before we then try and band-aid it at the end when we can only do so much?
I mean, our government pensions and benefits are meant to be a safety net to support people when they fall over, and exactly that, so that they can actually get back up at some point. But I think what we end up seeing is that once people end up on those government payments, that they often stay there. There is actually no way, it becomes like a trap, no way of getting out.
We're doing a longitudinal study now with a program that's supporting families who are homeless at risk of the child protection system. And housing is such a strong predictor of a child having fewer child protection notifications, fewer substantiated harms, and massively increased chance of being reunified with family. That we've proposed perhaps ironically, that every time a child's removed, the Director General has to write to Parliament and explain why they're removing rather than providing affordable housing. It is so clear that housing is actually what is the problem for these families. Yet we don't. And we don't, not because people are bad, we don't because of the inflexibility of our systems, the way that we're not connected, and the way that we don't aspire toward this more ambitious ending.
And I think tenant protections are critical here. If we go back to education, becoming homeless is really pointy end, but living in housing precarity or housing stress or housing hardship or after housing poverty means that you might be moving once a year. And if you've got kids in schools and they just get settled and then you move them again, and that's so disruptive for someone's education and that implication that we run our private rental system to allow some people to get rich, which is just not that important in the scheme of things, right, in human life, I don't think. Or there's other ways they can invest in something else. Let's just make housing for people, housing for the citizens that we all are, and we want to be enabled to have the qualities like literacy that enable us to exercise that. And then maybe I come back to you and say, yeah, okay, all people can have equal participation in the decisions, but people are excluded if they can't, if they don't get a good education and read and write. It's much more difficult to actually enact those citizen rights.
5 minutes. Does anyone, I mean, you guys have lived experience of homelessness. Do you have any questions for our panel?
Absolutely. I have actually a question for Cameron. So you talked a lot about ideas that resonate, and specifically what type of society do we want to live in? What type of society do we want to build? So I wanted to ask you, what is your vision?
My vision is that all people should have access to housing if they choose to as a right. To go to your point, that doesn't mean everyone needs to live in the same type of housing. But people should, as a citizenry right, have access to affordable and safe housing. If they choose to travel or live a way that's different, that's up to them. I think they should. I think we need to think about choices. Choice only makes sense if you have alternatives.
Yeah.
If you have the option of safe and affordable housing, but you don't want to live in that conventional way, then I, beyond anything else, support free will. But at the moment, people make free will in a very constrained sense where their options are so deplorable. So I think we want to have, in my ideal society, that each person, based on their humanity, their citizenship, has access to affordable housing if they choose. But and I think that we all have a responsibility, each of us, to ensure that happens. At the moment, we don't. That's a responsibility, is not something that's upheld. It might be to most, if not all of us in this room, but society writ large, that's not. So we need to push society toward this shared vision. I'm seeing some of the debates in some political parties at the moment, which is trying to further splinter, the haves and have-nots fighting with each other. And I don't think that's going to bring about the model. I think we've got cooperative means of housing that can bring governments, business, superannuation funds, and neighbours together, because we know the latter in terms of neighbours. Often they can be a great barrier to housing happening in there, but they don't want the fabric of their neighbourhood disrupted. We need to bring people along, so it's not a competition. It's not a further means to splinter us. I think there's enough in society about different identities when trying to splinter each other. I think we need to unify around this idea of how affordable housing is a right, but not something that we do begrudgingly, something that we do and celebrate. Again, but celebrate from the premise that people can choose to engage with it or not. They can choose different types of lives depending on the situation, right?
May I just briefly share a story? We actually had someone recently that came to us as a couple, and they had wanted a bit of a change in their work, and they thought it's the perfect time for us to pack up. We're going to work, take a van, explore Australia, and that's what they saw for a couple of years as their life, and it worked really well for them. They found some really loving communities and places and made friends across the state, or across the country, sorry. And then they had to come back to the state because one of them got unwell, and they went, well, we had a house before we moved into this van. We'll get a house again. Of course, came back to Tassie after COVID and went, we actually can't get back into the market. What do we do? Like, we've never considered ourselves homeless if we didn't have a house. So for us, our van was our home, where we happened to be for the night was our home. And then at this moment of going, we are now unwell and battling other bills. and we can't enter. Like they had to put their van outside of Hobart and came to us and said, like, it's no longer suitable for us to be there, but how do we get back in? So I think that first part of their journey, you know, if that's what people choose, and there's some great experiences from that, but how do we make sure people aren't excluded when the time comes that they might need somewhere with 4 walls and, you know, for them, what was the word? A secure power source so they could run the machinery and stuff they needed for, you know, breathing and the like. So, yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed when I'm working with my clients is that we have a conversation about something, and then in the conversation, we see the new action to take to cause the result that we want in the future. So what's happened here is we've had people come from around the country, we've shared all this new information. What I'm interested in hearing is what new actions are you going to take to cause the result that we're all hearing and that we're all seem to be coming to agreement on?
That sounds like a great final question. Who wants to go first?
If you like.
Yeah.
I think for us and for the Salvation Army, it's that continued advocacy and awareness. We need to get the community on board. If the majority of the community want action and change, that is when we're going to see our policymakers and our government hopefully get behind it. I think it's been highlighted. We need to continue our research. We need to continue to provide immediate supports now to fix some of the consequences of some of the things that have been put in place. But of course, we need to scream it from the rooftops. We need to be putting it out there to go. There are bigger things at play than trying to blame an individual or someone else's choice or circumstances. We need to change our structures, and we need everyone to get behind it. We need business, we need government, we need community, we need non-profit sector, and just not letting it drop. If we go, oh, I'll sit it on the side burner, we'll get back to it. I'd probably prefer this to happen for me. No one's going to take action. So bring it up whenever you get the chance. For those that are ever in a room with anyone that is the we in some regards, you know, raising it is a key concern for us.
Yeah, I think I think one of the things that I really worry about is that this issue and the issue that's around poverty and homelessness become almost invisible, or because we start to normalise them. We're talking a lot about cost of living, but we don't really sometimes think about what that means, and that these are real people experiencing their lives without enough money to afford the absolute basics, and in living in poverty and often experiencing housing poverty and stress, and then often homelessness. So I agree with Amelia. I think we have to, like, when we talk a lot to journalists and we, you know, do a lot of media, and sometimes they say, oh, sorry, we're talking to you about this poverty issue again, but, you know, we're not sure what kind of angle we need to take. And I was like, you've got to keep talking about this. We've got to keep getting this on the front page of paper, because we need action. We need action as a community. And I really believe that the only way we're going to solve these issues is if we address it as a community. It's not just for the community sector or the state or federal government or local government. We need to do this as a community. We really need to address this problem. Like, again, in that 2019 edition of Parity, we were talking about housing crisis in Tasmania. I would say now, you know, that crisis word just, again, we're starting to normalise that. That's just sort of how it is. It's really, for me, gone way beyond a crisis. But I think that, yes, absolutely, that advocacy word, and also just that it's beholden on all of us to take some action here and make sure that we all have access to a safe and affordable home as an absolute basic human right.
I guess I would say there's probably 3 things on my list that I'm taking. Because I work in advocacy, so doing my job is one of those things. Second one is send a note to Matt, because I want to get a copy of his slides and his statistics. The third one is in a more broad, sort of like communicating more broadly with people in the community. I think encourage people to understand the systems and then take their own action. I can do so much as one person, but if more people have better understanding, they could, you know, the power of men is hopefully changeable. And to that end, sort of encouraging people to read things like Condition of Parity, which has got some really nice things in it. For those of you who haven't read it already, it's one of the, not that I mean to say not all editions are fabulously impressive, no, they're all wonderful, but I did find this a particularly impressive one. Also, Cam's book, I think, is a really nice analysis of homelessness. it talks about those structural issues, and it's, even though it is an academic book, it's actually very readable and very insightful and thoughtful. So I'm going to send a little note to the State Library to order a copy. So those are my takeout actions.
We're not one system too.
Oh, very good idea. You can actually order through the different libraries a book that's anywhere held in the state library system. So, but I would actually suggest that they have multiple copies. I might have one where I have a reading group on it. Maybe I have a reading group.
Okay, so in answer to your question of what action are we going to take, because we've spoken a lot about ideals and social structures, and the buzzword that keeps coming up is, oh, it's about money. I want to stress this point so much. It's not about money. We don't need money. Money is a concept that we have elevated to the position of God. Okay? What we need is food, water, shelter, and for all of those things, all we need is each other and trust. The solution is to cultivate community. We can do that by setting up a free trade hub in the city. That would go absolute wonders for helping people on every level. Just trial that in Tasmania. And if we go successfully, which it will, we can then spread that across Australia. There are real, very practical solutions that we can implement. And again, education. University has an amazing opportunity to offer knowledge, one of the greatest resources for free to the youth in all areas of the university and studying. And again, that's a very low economic cost solution that will help people that have lived experiences and create generational change. It addresses the core of the issue. So if we want to focus on solutions, which I hope we do, there they are. There are some very simple, easily implementable changes that we can actually work towards.
Thank you. Deborah's looking at me with increasingly frank expression. I'm going to have to bring this to the flow. And I'm trying to think of something profound to say to wrap it up. I'm going to go with Cynthia talked about how we doesn't always mean everyone. But I think for most of us, there are times in our lives when it includes us. And we should probably be conscious when it does include us, that we are doing something. So thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for contributing as well. Thank you.
Thanks to our panel members, and the energy in this room does fill me with optimism that we are all going to be spurred into action. And thank you for always reminding us about that, because sometimes you don't want to sit there talking about the policy. It's got to be, what are the practical things that we can do to make sure that we can make life better for people experiencing this last speaker, who is often has the hardest gig of the lot, because they're standing between you, your hunger, and the cake that's over there. But on this note, I do want to introduce my colleague, Tom Johnson, to close out this session today. I do want to say that he was at Uniting UTAS, and Council of Homeless Persons was very happy to steal him from that position, and he is now the Deputy CEO, and the reason he's coming to do the concluding remarks is he was instrumental in getting this edition around poverty and homelessness up and running when he was at Uniting UTAS. So on that note, I'll introduce you to Tom Johnson.
I'm a bit hoarse today. I have flown down from Melbourne, where hay fever is at its all-time worst. Thank you to all the speakers. I think we've had a wonderful conversation around how we can end poverty and the interrelationship between the reason that our magazine exists, which is about ending homelessness. I was reflecting on what the lived experience panel was saying about how do we have the conversations in community and within society to create that change. And part of our role at Council of Homeless Persons is talking to people that are not yet equipped with the skills and the knowledge to be able to be advocates. So I was at a local government forum, and lo and behold, a member of Anthony Albanese's cabinet was sitting at the front table in front of me. And my task for that morning was to talk about what causes homelessness. And so the number one cause of homelessness is financial instability, and that's poverty. And what's that driven by? Income support, income, wages. And seeing those charts, wow, I was taking shots at them. Wonderful, beautiful. And what I said is the Albanese government, and we're talking at a national level here, it's a national magazine. During the election, the whole time, they promised to ensure that they would bring people above the poverty line. That was their policy position. They called upon 2 expert panels, and they came back with exactly the same advice: lift income support above the poverty line. And they chose not to. And that goes to what you were talking about, Professor, that it's a choice. It was a conscious choice. I didn't know that cabinet minister was going to be sitting in front of me as I was talking about this, but you could see him squirming in his seat because he knew that the choice was between those people around the cabinet table as to whether, through their budget, people live in poverty or they don't. It was a simple choice. And it's really interesting that we're having these conversations today. But I think that what we need to do is go and have those conversations in the community. And I think what we're showing here today with that final panel, with the lived experience panel, that it's very easy. It's not complicated. And we know that we can end homelessness, and it's possible. So that's my reflections. As you know, I've worked across Victoria and Tasmania, spent a lot of time talking with service users and consumers down here in Victoria. And I spoke with one consumer when I was down here last year. And so she shared her, let's call it, horrific story. And after we'd reflected, she said, what can we, like, how can I share your story and what would you like me to do with your voice? And she said, tell my story of me and my children and share that whenever you're talking to decision makers and to the community. So I wanted to leave with her reflections. So she said at the time, I'm living in a van with a queen-size mattress and a tiny TV with my 3 kids and my niece. I want them, the Tasmanian government, to know that my 4-year-old son asked Mum, where are we staying tonight? Every night that's what he asks me. And every night I've got to say, the van buddy. And he says, Mummy, I want to stay in a hotel. I don't want to stay there. She reflects on it's hard to hear my 4-year-old son say that, where are we staying? And he wants to stay in a hotel, not a van. I've never lived this way, and I've never pictured myself living in this way. It's disgusting. It's gross. The only thing I'm trying to do is protect my 3 children. And I think to close, 1 in 6 children in Australia live in poverty, and that's a choice. So I think that came crystal clear through Bronwyn's opening remarks. Professor, Matt, in your presentation, came clear from the lived experience panel, and then from the direct experience of the salvos from Shelter Tas and from TASCOSS, fierce advocates down here. And I think that's a way to close, that it's a choice and we know the solution. Matt, your beautiful chart showed that we did it. Like, how great was that? You know, poverty line, you know, and then that cascaded in the form. So finish with that. But I think it aims us as advocates, all of us in the room, to share those stories of service users, consumers, and to continue the advocacy, because we'll get there. Thank you.
So that is officially the end, but I get in trouble if I don't acknowledge the sponsors. And to Noel, who has to ring around like you wouldn't believe to get money for every single edition. And If you haven't been called, it means he hasn't got your number. So thank you, Noel, for all the work you do to make it happen. So the sponsors I want to thank are Uniting Vic Tas, Vincent Care Victoria, the Salvation Army, Anglicare, TASCOSS, and Catholic Social Services. I want to thank everyone who spoke today, but most importantly, I want to thank you for the work you do every day on the front line, and please stay and join us for tea and coffee.